I'm Ryan Lee James. I serve as the director of the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy and its free online Cox campus at the Atlanta Speech School. And I am so excited to be here today, officially kicking off Litlink, which is our teacher-focused literacy conference that the Rollins Center and Speech School are partnering with Department of Ed in Georgia to make possible for teachers here around our state. And I really get the privilege, the esteemed privilege of being with Dr. Maggie Gillis this afternoon, who serves as the president and founder of Literacy How. And that title and intro is so boring because Margie is a dear colleague and now friend. She has done an immense amount in the field of literacy to move this work forward in Georgia, but also across the nation. And so really delighted to have Maggie Gillis, literacy leader, here with us this morning.
Thank you. Great
Welcome.
to be here.
All right.
Great to be here.
So I guess I'll just kick off asking Margie a real high-level question so you can go in any direction with it. You have so much knowledge. So excited for folks to really hear from you. For people who are not familiar, I think we're so familiar. I'm a speech therapist. We work with teachers and school leaders every day, day in and day out. But just for the general public, I don't know that people are as familiar with the illiteracy or literacy crisis that we're facing in our country. So can you just tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I can tell you about it. It makes me sad to tell about it, except it is so very important to highlight what a crisis this is. It is, in terms of my opinion, it's the biggest crisis we have in this country, in this nation. And the crisis is this, that we have roughly 33% of our children in the United States reading on grade level, 33%. So that means that you can't read well, you just can't access information, and you can't be your best self. And this is really good data that has been collected for 30 plus years with the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is the nation's report card. It's an excellent assessment because we can compare ourselves with other states. We can disaggregate the data by race and socioeconomic status, special education status. We can really dig into the data and see the story it tells, which is really important for our country to understand how pervasive this is. What is also important to know is since 1992, when we started collecting this data and had the nation's report card, nothing has changed significantly. And as much as we've had policies in place over the years, we haven't seen a major change across the country. If we disaggregate, which of course is really important to do, we have the state of Mississippi, which many people have probably heard about. It's been in popular press, New York Times, that Mississippi went from 49th in the United States in terms of their NAEP scores to 13th in the United States, above the national average. Now, it took them years, because to change what's happening in terms of how reading is taught takes years to change, but they did it. And they are just an incredible example of what can be done at a state level. And then, of course, we could drill down to the district level, the school level, et cetera. But this is a huge crisis. If you can't read, again, you can't make it in the world unless you have support systems, which many children do not have, to get them to that point of reading proficiency.
Yeah. So you just said a lot. So we're going to have to unpack some of that. So I think the first thing to unpack is the point that you made around a 30-year span of time. And the NAEP is the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is a nationwide assessment that our students take across the country in 4th, 8th,
and I think 12th grade. A subset, yep.
So if things have remained relatively unchanged, so you said around 33% of children reading proficiently as a whole, of course we can disaggregate that. And like all major public health crises, we see that the illiteracy crisis disproportionately impacts children of color, children from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds. What's interesting though is that what you said about things remaining relatively unchanged. So what would you say about the COVID-19 pandemic? Because there's a lot of conversation immediately sort of returning to schools after COVID that, we were just in such despair. Our children can't read. We've had so much learning loss due to COVID. But I think what you and I both know, and I'm so glad you raised it, is that COVID really did not cause the illiteracy crisis in our country.
No, not at all. I think it shined a light on the literacy crisis in a way that was probably good, because people just assumed that our low literacy scores were a result of COVID. They went down for sure. We have data to show that in most states, with the exclusion, I think, of Mississippi, actually,
Wow.
the scores went down. But no, they were bad to begin with, and they've just gotten worse. And I think what COVID did was, again, shine a light on how profound this problem is, and that COVID just helped us understand why being in school settings, with other people, versus virtual learning. I mean, there were a lot of things we learned from COVID. It was important to bring kids back to school to have face-to-face learning, for example. We tried out virtual learning. It worked for some, but for most children, learning to read, learning anything is a social engagement enterprise, and you can't socially engage on a computer screen. If you have to do that to practice and so forth, fine. But the explicit instruction that children need, especially children who are struggling need, couldn't happen during COVID very well. So whether it was 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or longer that children were out of school during COVID, that really handicapped them further.
Yeah.
But it was not so good to begin with.
Yeah. I'm so glad we're talking about that, because I feel like the general public has not really been clear about that. And I think it's such an important point to make, not to play the blame game, but just for the reasons that we're talking about today. How can we move our state forward? I mean, we're here in Georgia, but you're from Connecticut. How can we move our country forward? How can we move children and families forward? So another question that I want to ask, just a couple more. So if we're thinking about children who don't learn to read and don't become proficient in reading, obviously they matriculate through school and then become adults. So what can you tell us about adult illiteracy rates and how that impacts our economy, our society, our national security? I mean, we could go on and on, because I think sometimes we think about, oh gosh, children aren't learning to read. And it's almost as if we think something miraculous happens between like 4th and 12th grade where they graduate reading. And that doesn't happen. We have illiterate adults in our country.
Oh, tremendous number of illiterate adults. And I guess there are a couple things to that point. Like, if you don't learn to read in first grade, which is when most children learn to read, and it takes several years to learn, so it doesn't just happen overnight. It's 2 to 3 years to become proficient. So you start out in kindergarten, first, second. By third grade, we hope kids are proficient readers, because then you're really reading to learn, right? You're absorbing content, you're building background knowledge, your vocabulary is growing. But if you don't learn in those early grades, you have a 1 in 8 chance of catching up. Why is that? Because the curriculum moves forward. And if you haven't learned to read, the second grade teacher, the third grade teacher, fourth grade, et cetera, isn't equipped to teach you to learn to read. They're equipped to teach their content. Yeah. And it just gets harder and harder for the child who's behind to ever get the intervention, the instruction that they need to catch up. So they do matriculate. They get passed forward. They even graduate from high school with very low literacy skills. And they try maybe to go to a community college, but they have to take courses to be able to take credit-bearing courses. They have to take courses, remediation courses, to learn to read, and they end up dropping out. And what do they do, in lieu of that? Well, we know what happens. It's the prison pipeline, as Kareem talked about this morning. It is the skill that you have to make it in life. And there are adult literacy programs. I've worked in them for years. They're very ineffective because the adults are in survival mode at that point. They're working several jobs. They try to go to these literacy programs. A lot of times the people that are instructing don't have the deep knowledge that they need to have, because it's harder to teach an adult to read, for sure, because there's so many co-occurring challenges that they have: anxiety, they might be depressed, they might be using substance. Like, there's so many things working against them that it just makes it that much harder. So yeah, it's a ripple effect that just compounds over time. And as Kareem talked about this morning, most of the people in prison are there because they never learned to read. That is the truth of the matter.
Wow.
So we have to change that. Obviously, that can't happen.
Yeah.
We have to stop that, and we have to do it by teaching kids right in the first place, finding them early.
Keep going, Margie, because that's my next question.
Early, right?
What is it that we need to do? What needs to happen?
First of all, just building the awareness, which Mike is going to do through this, right through this conversation. We just have to keep pounding away at making people aware. Emily Hanford, amazing APM investigative journalist, reporter, who's really been shouting this from the rooftops, but we can't shout it loudly enough and forcefully enough so that everybody knows this is a problem, and that every single person in this country can do something about it. We all have a role to play in it. We all have to own it.
Yeah.
Because it's ours to own. Our kids are not going to get where they need to go unless every one of us acknowledges that this is a problem and that we can change it. But it's not going to be easy to change, because we know change is hard. The fundamentals problems driving this are myriad. Teacher prep programs haven't prepared teachers adequately. It's not having a focus on prevention. Like, we need to find children who are at risk as early as possible. That means at birth. If you have a history of reading difficulties in your family, that's a number one risk factor. If you know that as a parent, you had trouble learning to read, your mother had trouble learning to read, then your child is at risk. Not because we're going to put a red flag up or around them, but to say, I need my pre-K teacher or my caregiver or whatever to know that my child needs more, needs attention, needs to be paid attention to, needs to be talked to, like language interactions and all of the things that we know and love about the oral language piece. That just needs to be called out. But parents need to know to do that, right? So the work that's been done in Marietta with the birth to 5 and the work in the birthing hospitals to make parents of newborn children aware of this is huge, because we can make it a much bigger difference if we prevent it versus, try to put a stopgap measure on something that is harder to tackle.
So I just have one more question. You were going there talking about what's happening in Marietta City schools and throughout Marietta here in Georgia. And I'm so appreciative, because what you're saying about everybody needs to be all hands on deck, because this issue around illiteracy, it's been here for a long time. We see it having an even greater impact in our society today. Obviously, we haven't even touched on this because there's so much, but you did a little bit when you talked about depression and anxiety. We see children who are really struggling with being able to regulate their own behavior and what that's doing in schools. But this is so important, talking about why everybody needs to be engaged and why this is not just for educators or parents to worry about, that this is really an issue for broader society to take interest in and action on. But can you just tell us as we close, where in the country, states, school districts, cities, who is leading the way in this work around literacy reform?
As I mentioned, Mississippi is probably the shining beacon of what to do to change, just because they've been at it for, I think, 2013, maybe even before that, with the Barksdale Reading Institute. And that is such a great example of what it takes, because that was private philanthropy coming together with a State Department of Education, coming together with school districts that wanted to step up and try it. So there were lots of people who were working together to build systems. So Mississippi is one. Kareem this morning talked about some great things happening in Delaware. There's Tennessee, Alabama, interestingly, southern states, not so great in the Northeast, in the northern states, and I think there are several reasons for that, I believe, coming from one of those states. I think teachers' unions are really tough because they have a lot of sway in what happens, and it shouldn't be that way necessarily, but that's what it is. In terms of districts, I would cite Marietta as a shining example. We have a couple in Connecticut and Massachusetts, too, that are doing great work. But Marietta is the district that I know the best, and you and I have worked there for the last 3 years, and a great example of collaborative effort.
Yes. Well, Margie, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Can't thank you enough for your partnership.
Thank you for inviting me.
Want to say again that Margie is the president and CEO, founder of Literacy How, and I am Ryan Lee James from the Rollins Center and Free Online Cox Campus, and glad to be with you.